I need you to understand something before you judge me. When they cut the ice away from its face and the floodlights hit those eyes, I was the first one to say they were only glassed over by frost. I was the first one to laugh. That's the part that keeps me awake. Not what it did later. Not the blood. The laugh. Because I saw those eyes open in the permafrost, and I chose to believe they weren't looking back at me. If I had said what I knew in that moment, if I had admitted that something under the ice was still aware, 3 men might still be alive. I tell myself that confession changes nothing, but I'm telling you anyway, because the ground in Yakutsk doesn't forget, and neither do I. We found it in late February, when the cold has weight, when the air feels like broken glass in your lungs, and the sun hangs low and useless. Yakutsk in winter is not a place for revelations. It's a place for endurance. The snow squeaks under your boots like dry bones. Your eyelashes freeze together if you blink too slow. Even the silence feels preserved. We were there for mammoth tissue. That was the grant. That was the clean, respectable story. A university-backed excavation near the Lena River, a ridge of exposed permafrost collapsing under slow erosion. There had been reports of fur surfacing after a minor thaw the previous summer. Nothing unusual. Siberia has been giving up its dead for years now. Perfectly preserved bison, cave lions curled like sleeping cats. The past, sealed and patient. I had built my career on that patience, on the idea that ice keeps secrets faithfully. My team was small. It had to be. Funding was tight, and the logistics of drilling into ground that resists the idea of spring are brutal. There was Pavel, broad-shouldered and quiet, who had grown up not far from there and treated the land like a relative, respectful, cautious. There was Dennis, younger, brilliant with equipment, impatient in the way only someone who hasn't yet been punished by nature can be. And there was me. I was the one who wrote the proposals, the one who believed knowledge justifies intrusion. The first week was ordinary, in the way hardship becomes routine. The cold settled into us like an extra organ. We worked in slow, deliberate motions. Diesel fumes hung low around the generators. The drills chewed at ancient soil. The sun moved in a shallow arc, barely rising, barely leaving. At night, the sky went black and endless, stars sharp enough to wound. We found fragments at first, fur clumps frozen into silt, a partial tusk too degraded to salvage. Disappointing, but not catastrophic. The ridge had more to give. On the 8th day, Dennis hit something that wasn't mammoth. The drill bit screeched and shuddered, a metallic protest that carried across the snowfield. I remember the sound because it didn't belong there. It was too high, too alive. He killed the engine, and the silence afterward felt expectant. We cleared the area by hand, shovels first, then smaller tools. The ice was dense, layered with sediment like pages in a book written in cold. About a meter down, Pavel's shovel struck something that didn't sound like bone. It was dull, solid, not hollow. We brushed away frost and grit. Fur emerged, dark, coarse, longer than wolf, shorter than bear. The color was wrong. Not the pale, faded brown of ancient hide, but a deeper shade, almost black where the ice hadn't bleached it. Dennis grinned. "Wolf," he said. "Big one." He was already imagining the headlines. Preserved Pleistocene predator, intact musculature. I crouched beside the exposed patch and pressed my gloved hand against it. The fur was stiff with frost, but beneath it, the shape was wrong. The curvature of the shoulder was too steep. The limb beneath was angled differently than any wolf I had studied. I told myself, deformation happens, ice shifts, time compresses. We widened the excavation, slowly, carefully. The outline grew. A torso, elongated, 4 limbs, longer than expected, with joints set higher, more flexible. The paws were wrong. Not quite paws. The digits were too distinct, the claws too curved and narrow. Mutation, Dennis said lightly, but his voice had thinned. We worked in silence after that. When we uncovered the head, the wind picked up. It howled down the ridge, carrying loose snow in sharp spirals. The face was angled slightly upward, as if it had been looking toward the surface when it died. The muzzle was long, but not as long as a wolf's. The jaw heavier, the teeth visible where the lips had retracted in freeze. They were too many, or maybe just too prominent. I counted without meaning to. The ears were laid back against the skull, and the eyes, God, the eyes were open. Not wide, not straining, just open. The ice had formed a thin, translucent glaze over them, preserving the iris in a cloudy amber. There was no collapse, no deflation like you see in other specimens. They hadn't sunken, they hadn't burst, they were intact. Watching. Dennis let out a low whistle. Pavel crossed himself without thinking. I felt something else. Not fear, not yet. Recognition. Not of the creature, of the posture. It wasn't lying like an animal caught unaware. It looked braced, tense, as if it had been fighting the cold until the last possible second. I should have called it then, catalogued the find, requested immediate transfer to a controlled lab. Instead, I leaned closer. I wiped frost from one eye with the back of my glove. The amber cleared slightly, and for a fraction of a second, so brief I almost convinced myself it was a trick of refracted light, the pupil tightened. I laughed, that stupid, brittle sound. Just the light, I said. Relax. Dennis laughed too, grateful for permission. Pavel didn't. He stared at me as if measuring something. That was the first moment, the first choice. We expanded the trench. The body was massive, nearly 3 meters from snout to hind quarters, not counting the tail. The hind legs were powerful, structured almost like a digitigrade human's, elongated in a way that suggested upright movement. I didn't say that out loud. I told myself morphology can be deceptive in frozen remains. The forelimbs ended in hands, not paws. Hands with elongated fingers and curved talons. 5 digits. Opposable structure suggested by the angle of the thumb. Dennis swore softly. Pavel stepped back. The wind intensified, rattling the equipment tarps. "It's not wolf," Pavel said. It wasn't a question. I opened my mouth to reply, but I didn't know which lie to choose, so I chose the simplest one. It's something we don't understand yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. The generator hummed outside the temporary shelter. The cold pressed in from every direction. I kept seeing the eyes, open, not wild, not enraged, aware. I told myself nerves were normal. Discovery carries adrenaline. The mind fills gaps with myth when data is incomplete. I almost said the word Dogman in my head and immediately rejected it. Folklore thrives in places like Yakutsk. Stories about things that move between trees on 2 legs, about howling that isn't wolf. I had dismissed them all my life. Science doesn't entertain campfire shadows. It dissects them. The next morning, the frost around the creature's face had melted slightly, despite the sub-zero air. That was the second moment. The temperatures had dropped overnight. There was no reason for thaw, yet the ice over the eyes was thinner. Dennis noticed first. "Did you adjust the heaters?" he asked. I hadn't. Pavel hadn't. We checked the readings. Everything was stable. The body's chest cavity showed faint cracking in the ice, as if internal expansion had occurred. "Gas release," I said quickly. "Decomposition gases trapped in tissue." Dennis nodded, clinging to the explanation. Pavel looked at the sky. We continued, because that's what men do when they sense the edge of something they can't categorize. They keep moving. By midday, more of the torso was exposed. The rib cage was enormous, flared wide. Beneath the fur, you could see the suggestion of dense musculature, even in death. Then he set up additional lights for documentation. When the beams hit the face directly, the amber eyes seemed almost wet, reflective. I knelt again. I don't know why I felt compelled to be close to it. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that proximity erased superstition. I brushed away another thin layer of frost. The pupil contracted again, slower this time. Not a trick, not light, a deliberate narrowing. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned in closer, my face inches from its own. The cold radiated off it like a living thing. And then I saw it. A faint tremor beneath the ice at the throat, so slight it could have been settling. But it wasn't. It was rhythm. I stood up too fast and nearly slipped. Dennis looked at me. "What?" he asked. And here is where everything could have changed. I could have said, "It's alive." I could have ordered immediate cessation, emergency protocols. Instead, I heard my own voice say, "We need to accelerate extraction before structural collapse." Professional, controlled, a lie wrapped in procedure. Pavel stared at me for a long moment. "It's not dead," he said quietly. The wind carried his words away, but I heard them. "It's been frozen for thousands of years," I snapped, more sharply than intended. "Nothing survives that." Even as I said it, I knew I was arguing with myself. We rigged a lifting harness. The ice around the lower half was stubborn, fused hard. Dennis used a thermal lance to carefully cut channels. The hiss of heated metal against ancient frost filled the air. Steam rose in ghostly plumes. The smell hit us then. Not rot, not exactly. It was metallic, animal, like wet iron and fur after rain. Too fresh. My stomach tightened. Pavel stepped back again. "We shouldn't," he said. I didn't respond. The harness secured around the torso and under the forelimbs. When the winch engaged, the cables groaned. The body shifted. Ice cracked in long, echoing fractures that traveled outward like spider webs. And then the head moved, just slightly, a tilt, a correction of balance as gravity changed. Dennis froze with his hand on the controls. We all saw it. There was no denying it now. The eyes were no longer cloudy. The amber was clear, focused, on us, on me. The mouth opened a fraction, not enough to bare teeth fully, just enough to release a thin stream of vapor into the air. Breath, ancient, cold breath. Dennis whispered something I didn't catch. Pavel backed away entirely, shaking his head. "It's wrong," he said. I stepped forward, because I couldn't accept the alternative. If it was alive, then everything I believed about preservation, about time, about the limits of biology, everything fractured. I reached out. My gloved hand hovered inches from its muzzle. The skin beneath the fur twitched. Fast, reflexive. The hand snapped up and closed around my wrist. Not clumsy, not weak, precise. The grip was crushing. The claws pierced through insulated fabric as if it were paper. I heard my own bones protest before I felt the pain. Dennis screamed. Pavel lunged forward with the emergency axe. The creature's other hand broke free from the remaining ice with a sound like tearing cloth. It moved with terrifying coordination. The axe never landed. The forearm caught Pavel mid-swing. There was a crack. His body folded in a way bodies shouldn't. The creature rose. Ice cascaded off it in heavy sheets. It unfolded upward, hind legs extending, spine straightening. It stood taller than any man there, fur matted with meltwater, steam rising from its shoulders. Its eyes never left mine. I was still trapped in its grip. I couldn't breathe. Dennis fumbled with something. Flare gun, I think. A bright red burst ignited near the creature's side. It flinched, more irritated than harmed. Its head snapped toward Dennis. The sound it made then wasn't a howl. It was deeper, resonant. It vibrated in my chest. A warning. Dennis tried to run. He didn't get far. The creature released me and covered the distance in 2 strides. I won't describe what happened in detail. I can't. I remember snow turning dark too quickly. I remember the smell, hot, coppery, immediate. I remember the silence afterward, broken only by the generator's steady hum, absurdly normal. Pavel wasn't moving. Dennis wasn't either. The creature stood between their bodies, chest rising and falling. It turned back to me. I was on my knees, clutching my bleeding wrist. The cold bit into exposed skin. Our eyes met again. And in them, I didn't see mindless hunger. I saw assessment, calculation. It took a step toward me. Slow, deliberate. I thought then that this was the inevitable arc of arrogance, that I had unearthed judgment. It crouched, bringing its face level with mine. Its breath washed over me, warm despite the air. It inhaled deeply, as if memorizing my scent. Then it did something I still don't understand. It released a low rumble, not aggressive, almost contemplative, and it stepped back, turned, and walked toward the tree line on 2 legs, each step confident, unhurried. At the edge of the ridge, it paused, looked back once, then disappeared into the frozen forest. I stayed there for I don't know how long. The cold should have killed me. Shock should have taken me. But I was left. That was the 3rd choice. It spared me. Rescue came 2 days later after our missed check-in triggered concern. I told them it was an accident. Equipment failure. Structural collapse. I showed them Pavel's broken body. Dennis's torn parka. I omitted the standing footprints leading into the woods. I omitted the hand-shaped bruises on my wrist. They believed what was easier. They always do. I returned home with a cast and a commendation for bravery under catastrophic conditions. I attended 2 funerals. I listened to grieving families call it tragedy. I said nothing about eyes opening in ice. But sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels thin, I smell it again. Wet iron, fur. I hear that low, resonant sound in my chest. And I know the permafrost did not preserve a relic. It preserved a survivor. Something that endured not by accident, but by will. Something that waited, and I was the one who thawed it. You might ask why it spared me. I ask myself that every day. Was it mercy? Recognition? Or did it see in me the same flaw it carries? The refusal to die when the world demands it? I don't know. What I do know is this. 3 months after the incident, satellite collars tracking wolf populations near Yakutsk began failing. Rangers reported livestock mutilations, unlike typical predation. Bodies left arranged, deliberate. I read the reports quietly. I saw the patterns. 2-legged stride lengths in snow before shifting to 4. Witness accounts dismissed as hysteria. I didn't correct them, because to acknowledge it publicly would mean admitting my part in its return. Sometimes I dream of the ridge, of the ice cracking, of amber eyes clearing. In the dream, I choose differently. I shout. I run. I burn the body where it lies. But the dream always ends the same way. The eyes open anyway. Because maybe it was never about the ice. Maybe it was never truly asleep. And maybe what we found in Yakutsk wasn't something ancient dragged into the present. Maybe it was something patient, letting us believe we discovered it, letting us think we were in control. The ground there is shifting more every year. The permafrost is thawing. Secrets are surfacing. I watch the data. I track anomalies. And I wait. Because part of me knows this story isn't finished. It looked at me not like prey, not like enemy, but like witness. And witnesses are meant to remember. So I am remembering for you now. Not as a scientist, not as a man who laughs at impossible things, but as someone who felt ancient fingers close around his bones and understood, too late, that some things endure the ice because they belong to it, and some doors once opened do not close again. I tried to convince myself that distance would dilute it, that thousands of kilometers between me and the Lena River would thin whatever thread had been tied that day. I returned to lectures, to clean labs and fluorescent lighting, to the smell of ethanol and printer toner instead of diesel and frozen soil. I wore long sleeves to hide the scars on my wrist, 5 crescent marks, evenly spaced, too deliberate to be an accident. People called me lucky. I let them. Luck is easier to accept than intention. The first sign that it wasn't over came in the form of an email I almost deleted. It was from a regional wildlife biologist stationed outside Yakutsk. He had read my field report, said he respected my work, said he needed a second opinion on something unusual. Attached were photographs, snowfields, tree line, carcasses. At first glance, wolf predation. But the angles were wrong. The precision was wrong. A reindeer laid out on its back, chest cavity opened with surgical neatness, organs removed, not eaten on sight, arranged in a line beside the body, as if catalogued. I zoomed in on the snow around it. There they were, tracks that began as elongated, narrow impressions, 2 of them set in a bipedal stride, deep, confident. After several meters they shifted. The pattern widened. 4 prints. The gait altered seamlessly, as if the body had folded forward mid-step. I stared at the screen until my eyes watered. The biologist had circled a section in red. Any known deformities that could explain this locomotion, he had written. Locals are telling stories. I'd prefer data. So would I. I drafted 3 different replies before settling on the safest lie. Possible aberrant wolf behavior combined with snow melt distortion. Recommend camera traps. He responded within minutes. Already deployed. That night I dreamed of the ridge again. But this time it wasn't the excavation. It was after. I was alone in the camp. The generators silent. The sky green with aurora. And from the tree line, a silhouette watching. Upright, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I woke with a taste of metal in my mouth. Weeks passed. Reports accumulated quietly. Livestock losses increasing. Not chaotic. Targeted. Rangers describing a pattern of surveillance. Animals spooked before dawn. Fences tested but not broken. Something assessing weaknesses. I told myself ecosystems react unpredictably to climate shifts. That thawing permafrost releases pathogens, alters migration, stresses predator populations. But pathogens don't arrange organs in straight lines. The camera trap footage arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I closed my office door before opening the file. Static at first. Snow drifting across the lens. Timestamp 0317. The frame adjusted to motion, thermal shift at the edge. A shape entered. It moved on 4 limbs initially, low and fluid. The fur caught the infrared glow in muted silver. Larger than any wolf recorded in the region. The shoulders rolled with heavy musculature. It approached the carcass left as bait. Then it paused, its head lifted. directly toward the camera. Even through grain and infrared distortion, I saw the eyes. Amber does not translate well to night vision, but there was a density there, a brightness that wasn't reflection. The body shifted, hind legs extended, spine straightened. It rose, not clumsily, not like a bear forced upright. It rose the way a man stands from a crouch, balanced, intentional. The forelimbs hung briefly at its sides before one lifted and reached toward the bait. The hand closed around the rope securing it. Claws flexed. It didn't take the meat. Instead, it stepped closer to the camera. My breath slowed without my permission. It tilted its head slightly, studying the device, and then it leaned forward until its face filled the frame. The lens fogged. Condensation spread across the glass. A warm exhale. The footage cut to static. I replayed that final second more times than I'll admit. In the reflection of the fogged lens, just before the feed died, there was a distortion, a shape behind it, a second silhouette at the tree line, smaller, lower to the ground. I shut the video off. For several minutes I sat in silence, listening to the hum of the building ventilation. My pulse thudded in my ears. It wasn't alone. That realization carried a different weight. One survivor is anomaly. Two is adaptation. I forwarded the footage to no one. Instead, I booked a flight. I told colleagues I needed closure. That survivor's guilt manifests in irrational returns to trauma sites. They nodded sympathetically. Academics understand obsession when it's dressed in the language of research. Yakutsk greeted me the same way it always had, air like shattered crystal, breath freezing mid-exhale. The sky a hard, colorless dome. The city moved in slow resilience beneath layers of fur and smoke. The biologist met me without ceremony. His name was Mikhail. Tired eyes, weathered face. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You saw it," he said, not a question. I held his gaze. "I saw something," I replied. He drove us out beyond the outskirts, past skeletal trees and snow-buried fences. The engine's rumble felt too loud in the quiet expanse. "There are stories," he said after a while. "Old ones. My grandmother used to warn us about the forest walking when the ground shifts." We laughed. I didn't. At the monitoring site, the camera hung broken, not smashed, detached cleanly from its mount and placed on a rock beneath the tree, as if returned, deliberate. We followed tracks, fresh, 2 sets, the larger stride unmistakable now to my trained eye, the smaller one less consistent, sometimes bipedal for a few steps, then collapsing into 4. Learning. My stomach turned. "How long?" I asked. Mikhail exhaled slowly. "Since your expedition." The words settled between us like falling ash. We reached a clearing where the snow had been disturbed extensively. No carcasses, no blood, just patterns, circles pressed into the surface, deep impressions where something heavy had sat repeatedly, facing outward, multiple directions, a vantage point, watching the open land. I knelt despite the cold biting through my layers. I pressed my gloved fingers into one of the impressions. It dwarfed my hand. "You think it's hunting?" Mikhail asked. "No," I said, before I could stop myself. He waited. "It's mapping." The wind shifted then, carrying a scent that didn't belong. Not decay, not wood smoke from distant cabins. Wet iron, fur. My throat tightened. Mikhail's head snapped toward the tree line. The forest was still, too still. No bird call, no shifting branches. Even the wind seemed to skirt around the trees rather than pass through them. A low sound vibrated faintly through the air, not loud enough to echo, but deep enough to feel. Recognition slammed into me like a physical blow. It wasn't a warning this time. It was a summons. The smaller tracks led away from the clearing, deeper into the trees. Mikhail looked at me, uncertainty cracking his composure for the first time. "We go back," he said quietly. Every rational part of me agreed, but another part, the one that had laughed at open eyes in ice, the one that had been spared, felt the pull of unfinished consequence. If there were two now, there would be more. If it was mapping, it was preparing. I stood slowly. The trees ahead seemed darker than the rest of the forest, as if light refused to settle there. The low vibration came again. Closer. Not hostile. Expectant. It knew I had returned. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. Mikhail took a step back toward the vehicle. I took one forward. The snow beneath my boot compressed with a sharp, brittle crunch that sounded far too loud. The vibration stopped. Silence rushed in, and from between two blackened trunks, amber caught the light. Amber doesn't glow in daylight. It absorbs it, holds it. The eyes between the trees did exactly that. No shine, no flare, just a dense, steady presence, as if light went in and something else watched back out. I didn't move. Neither did it. The forest felt suspended around us, branches iced over, air thin enough to slice the lungs. I became acutely aware of my pulse in my injured wrist, a dull throb beneath the glove, as if the scar tissue remembered before the rest of me did. Mikhail whispered my name behind me. It sounded small. I didn't answer. The shape shifted forward a fraction, enough for the outline to separate from shadow. Upright, shoulders broad, head slightly angled. The larger one, the survivor. It stepped into a shallow wash of light, and the fur along its arms stirred in a wind I couldn't feel. There was no rush, no display of teeth, just assessment. Then, lower to the ground and several meters to its left, something smaller moved, hesitant, half-crouched, amber eyes brighter, quicker. The second silhouette. Not a mate, not equal, an apprentice. My mouth went dry. The realization landed with a sick, methodical certainty. It hadn't just survived. It had reproduced, or found, or made, something to teach. Mikhail's breath came faster. "We leave," he said again, firmer this time. The smaller one took a step forward on two legs, wobbled slightly, then dropped to four with a fluid correction. Learning, practicing. The larger one did not look at it. Its gaze stayed on me. I felt the weight of that focus like a hand at my throat. I forced myself to speak, though my voice barely carried. "We're not armed for this." It was a stupid sentence. There is no weapon you pack for something that crosses categories. Mikhail shifted, snow crunching under his boot. That tiny sound broke the equilibrium. The smaller creature's head snapped toward him. The larger one moved then, not toward us, but sideways, placing itself between the smaller figure and the open clearing behind us. Protective, strategic, not feral. A thin ribbon of vapor escaped its mouth, steady and controlled. I recognized that breath, the same warmth against the lens months earlier. It took one step closer. The ground did not protest under its weight. It had learned how to move here without announcing itself. My mind raced for language that would keep this inside the realm of biology. Social hierarchy, territorial reinforcement, parent-offspring instruction. But none of those terms accounted for the way it regarded me. Not as threat, not as prey, but as continuity. The scar on my wrist burned suddenly, sharp and immediate. I winced despite myself. Its eyes flicked downward to the motion. The smallest tilt of its head followed. It remembered. The air shifted again, and that scent rolled over us. Wet iron, fur, something mineral and old. The smaller one edged closer to the larger, mimicking the posture, attempting upright stance again. It lasted longer this time. I saw the structure of its hind legs, the alignment of the pelvis. Not mutation, design. Mikhail's composure fractured. "This isn't real," he muttered, but his voice had lost conviction. I knew that tone. It was the same one I had used on the ridge, the same brittle denial. The larger creature made that low vibration again, deeper now. The smaller one stilled instantly at the sound. Command. Not random noise, communication. I felt the resonance in my sternum. It wasn't aimed at Mikhail, it was aimed at me. A memory uncoiled. The ridge, the broken bodies, the way it had inhaled near my face. Memorizing, tagging. I understood then that I hadn't been spared by accident. I had been marked as witness, as something useful. Mikhail grabbed my sleeve. "We're going." This time I nodded. Survival isn't courage, it's timing. We began to step backward in slow, deliberate motions. The larger one mirrored us, not advancing, just adjusting distance, maintaining equilibrium. The smaller one watched with bright, restless focus, half curiosity, half hunger. We reached the edge of the clearing. The vehicle was visible beyond the trees, a dull shape against white. The larger creature stopped. It did not pursue. It lowered to 4 limbs in one seamless motion, never breaking eye contact until the trees swallowed its outline. The smaller one lingered half a second longer before following. The forest resumed breathing. Wind returned in a thin sigh through branches. Sound came back in fragments. The creak of ice, distant wing beats. My legs felt hollow. We did not speak until we reached the vehicle and sealed the doors. Only then did Mikhail's restraint collapse into a string of whispered curses. His hands shook on the steering wheel. Mine were steady, which frightened me more. "You knew," he said finally. I looked out at the tree line. Yes. It was the first honest word I'd given anyone about it. He stared at me, betrayal and fear warring behind his eyes. "What is it?" The truth hovered at the edge of language and refused to condense. Monster was myth. Animal was insufficient. Relic was wrong. "Adaptive," I said at last, "and patient." We drove back in brittle silence. That night, in the dim guest room above the ranger station, I replayed the encounter frame by frame in my head. The protective positioning, the vocal control, the deliberate non-pursuit. It hadn't attacked. It had displayed, introduced the smaller one to the anomaly, me, a controlled exposure, as if showing it what a human looks like when it knows and keeps quiet. A chill worked its way deeper than the cold outside. It wasn't hunting randomly. It was studying, selecting, testing boundaries. And if it was teaching the smaller one, then this was generational. The permafrost hadn't preserved an accident. It had preserved a strategy. I slept badly. Dreams fractured into images of circles in snow, of vantage points carved into the land. I saw the smaller one's gait improving with each pass, fewer stumbles, longer upright strides. I woke before dawn to the sound of something against the outer wall of the building. A soft scrape, not forceful, curious. I held my breath. The scrape came again, slow, exploratory. Then a faint vibration, barely audible, but close enough that I felt it in the floorboards. Mikhail's door creaked open down the hall. "You hear that?" he whispered. I did. The vibration shifted position along the wall, then stopped directly beneath my window. I forced myself to stand, and moved toward it. Each step felt like walking toward confession. I parted the curtain a fraction. Frost obscured most of the glass, but through a thin, cleared crescent near the edge, I saw a shape below. Lower than the larger one, shoulders not yet fully broadened. The smaller creature craned its head upward, nostrils flaring. It was alone, testing proximity without supervision, learning boldness. Its eyes found the window, found me. It didn't flinch, it didn't retreat, it held the gaze, and in that stillness, I saw something unsettlingly familiar. Not rage, not hunger. Curiosity sharpened by instruction. The vibration came again, softer now. Not a threat, a question. I did not move. I did not breathe. After a long, suspended moment, it lowered back to 4 limbs and slipped into shadow without a sound. The scrape marks on the wall remained, thin, deliberate lines in the wood, measuring height, measuring resistance. By the time the sun edged weakly over the horizon, I understood something with cold clarity. This was escalation, not chaotic, not explosive, controlled increments. First mapping the land, then observing from distance, now testing structures, human dwellings, boundaries shrinking by degrees. It wasn't a rampage, it was integration. I looked at my wrist again. The scar seemed darker in the morning light, a reminder of first contact, of introduction. The larger one had shown restraint, the smaller one was practicing it, and practice, over time, becomes instinct. I stepped outside later with Mikhail to examine the marks. 4 parallel grooves scored into the wood, evenly spaced, deeper at the center where pressure increased. Not random scratching, calibration. Mikhail's face had drained of color. It came to the building, he said, as if naming it might undo it. I nodded. It's learning load-bearing limits. He stared at me. You sound like you're describing a colleague. That stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. Intelligence demands recognition, and recognition demands response. The forest beyond the station looked unchanged, peaceful even, but I knew better now. The larger one had introduced the smaller to me. The smaller had approached alone to assess our shelter. The sequence was deliberate. I felt something shift inside me then, not just fear, but obligation. This wasn't an outbreak. It was a lineage re-entering an ecosystem that had forgotten it, and I was the hinge point. The thaw had accelerated. The ridge where we had dug would be softer now, more collapses, more exposures. If one survived intact, what else lay waiting in ice? The thought pressed down hard enough to steal my breath. I had believed I opened a single door. But permafrost is not a vault with one lock. It is a field of sealed chambers, and the ground is warming. That evening, as the light faded into that endless Arctic blue, the low vibration rolled once more across the tree line. Distant, not close enough to threaten, just near enough to remind. The sound carried a different tone this time, steady, resonant, almost satisfied. I stood outside longer than I should have, letting the cold gnaw at my skin. I realized then that this was no longer about proving what it was. It was about deciding what to do with the knowledge that it was here, and that it was multiplying. Behind the trees, unseen but undeniably present, 2 sets of amber eyes watched the station lights flicker on. And somewhere beneath the thawing ground, something older than both of them might still be waiting its turn. I didn't tell Mikhail what I was really thinking, not that night. Not the next morning when we found the snow around the station crisscrossed with fresh tracks that began and ended without obvious approach. It was as if they materialized at the edge of visibility and dissolved the same way. He was already stretched thin between duty and disbelief. If I added what was forming in my mind, he might have tried to stop me. Or worse, report me. Because the truth was simple and corrosive. This wasn't containment anymore. It was courtship. Not in the romantic sense, in the ecological one. Territory testing, boundary negotiation, exposure without engagement. The larger one had shown the smaller how to approach a structure and withdraw, how to provoke attention without triggering retaliation. It was teaching it how to exist alongside us without being eradicated. That requires intelligence, patience, long-term modeling. Predators don't usually think in decades. I asked to see the ridge again. Mikhail resisted at first. "You saw enough," he said. "We reinforce the station. We call in more personnel." "And tell them what?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer. The drive out felt different this time. I wasn't returning to trauma. I was retracing responsibility. The sky hung low and white. The land rolled out in frozen monotony, deceptive in its calm. When we reached the site of the original excavation, the ridge had indeed shifted. Sections had collapsed inward, exposing darker seams of ancient soil beneath. The trench we'd carved months ago was gone, filled in by wind and settling ice, erased, but not untouched. There were impressions around the area, deep, repeated compressions in a loose semicircle facing the collapsed ridge. Multiple sizes, the larger stride unmistakable, the smaller one's attempts less symmetrical, but improving. They had come back, not randomly, repeatedly, to the origin point. I stepped out of the vehicle before Mikhail cut the engine fully. The cold hit harder here, more open exposure to the river wind. It felt appropriate, punitive. I walked to where the creature had first emerged from the ice. The exact coordinates were etched into my memory. I crouched and brushed snow aside with my glove. The soil beneath was darker than it should have been, not thawed, disturbed. Mikhail approached cautiously. "You think there are more," he said. "I think there were always more," I replied. Permafrost preserves in clusters, herds, dens. We'd found one because erosion exposed it. But if a single specimen could remain viable after millennia, then viability wasn't an accident. It was design supported by environment. What if the ice wasn't a tomb? What if it was dormancy? The idea felt insane even as it solidified. I moved further along the ridge, scanning for subtle depressions. There, a slight sag in the snow, elongated. Not yet collapsed, but thinner. The ground beneath it held tension. I felt it then. A faint vibration through my boots. Not the chest-deep resonance from the forest. This was subtler, muffled, from below. Mikhail stepped back instinctively. "Tell me that's just shifting ice." I couldn't. The vibration came again, rhythmic, slow, like something large adjusting position in confined space. I staggered backward, heart hammering. If the larger one had survived and thawed gradually, perhaps it had clawed its way out over days, weeks. But what if others were closer to the surface now? What if rising temperatures were shortening the distance between dormancy and emergence? A memory surfaced with brutal clarity, the way the first creature had been positioned in the ice, angled upward, braced, not frozen mid-run, frozen mid-ascent, trying to reach the surface, and we had finished the job. The wind swept hard across the ridge, momentarily drowning the subtle tremor. Snow skittered over the sagging section in thin, frantic lines. "We need to leave," Mikhail said, voice thin. "Yes," I agreed, but I didn't move. Because if there was something beneath that spot, something still suspended between states, then leaving meant waiting for a less controlled emergence. Near a village, a roadway, a herd. Containment would be impossible. The vibration intensified for a brief second, not violent, not desperate, aware. The larger one had returned here often. I could see it now in the pattern of compressions. It had stood watch over this section of ridge, guarded it, checked it, monitoring progress, teaching the smaller one where to come when the ground shifted. My breath fogged thick in front of me. "It's not random," I whispered. Mikhail's jaw clenched. "Nothing about this is random." A crack split the air, not thunder, not gunfire, a sharp report of internal ice fracture. The sagging section dipped another few centimeters. We both stumbled back. For a moment, nothing happened. Just wind and the hollow ringing in my ears. Then the surface settled again, deceptively calm. No breach, not yet. Mikhail grabbed my arm. "You wanted to see. You've seen." We retreated to the vehicle, but I kept my eyes on the ridge until distance swallowed detail. Even then, I felt it, the sense of being observed, not from the tree line this time, but from beneath the earth itself. Back at the station, I did something I should have done months ago. I pulled the original tissue samples from cold storage. Officially, they were categorized as degraded wolf-adjacent remains, ambiguous classification pending deeper genomic sequencing. I had delayed that sequencing under the excuse of contamination concerns. In truth, I was afraid of what clean data would confirm. The lab at the station was minimal, but sufficient for preliminary analysis. I extracted preserved muscle fibers from the original specimen. Even frozen, the cellular structure had been unnervingly intact. Too intact. Under magnification, the myofibrils showed density beyond typical canid parameters. Fiber alignment suggested tensile strength optimized for both quadrupedal sprinting and vertical load-bearing. Bipedal endurance. I ran the mitochondrial DNA amplification with gloved hands that didn't tremble until the readout stabilized. The sequence didn't align cleanly with wolf, or bear, or any cataloged canid, but fragments matched human markers at statistically impossible intervals. Not contamination, integration. My stomach lurched. Hybrid implies crossbreeding. This wasn't that. The markers weren't spliced in obvious patterns. They were interwoven at foundational levels, as if divergence had occurred long before modern taxonomy existed, a branch we never mapped, or chose not to. The door to the lab creaked open. Mikhail stepped inside, face pale from the cold. "They're back," he said. I didn't ask how he knew. The low vibration rolled through the floor faintly, just perceptible beneath the hum of equipment. Not close enough to attack, close enough to listen. I stared at the genetic data glowing on the screen. Human sequences braided through something older, denser. What survives ice? Not just muscle, memory, instinct, structure. If they had once existed alongside early humans, competed with them, perhaps even mirrored them, then permafrost could have preserved the lineage paused rather than extinguished. And Thor was pressing play. Mikhail's voice dropped to a whisper. "How many?" I thought of the ridge, the sagging earth, the guarded section. "At least one more," I said. The vibration deepened briefly, as if in acknowledgement. Mikhail swallowed hard. "We evacuate." "And send who?" I countered. "Armed teams? Drones? You think bullets fix something that plans?" He had no answer. Neither did I. Outside, snow began to fall in slow, deliberate flakes. The forest edge blurred into soft gray, visibility narrowing. The vibration stopped abruptly. Silence rushed in. That silence felt worse than the sound, because sound meant presence. Silence meant movement. I stepped to the window. Two shapes stood at the tree line, the larger one slightly behind the smaller now. Not leading, observing. The smaller one stood upright, without wobble, watching the station lights, watching us. And then slowly, deliberately, It took a step forward toward the open ground between forest and building. Not charging, not hunting, advancing, testing what we would do next. I didn't tell Mikhail to get his rifle. That's the part that will be dissected if this ever becomes public. Why I didn't escalate. Why I didn't default to force. But escalation is a language, and I was beginning to understand theirs. The smaller one stood in the open now, upright and steady, snow drifting across its shoulders without acknowledgement. The larger remained half-shadowed at the tree line, weight distributed evenly, a sentinel rather than a striker. The posture was unmistakable. Observe the exchange. Let the young one initiate. It wasn't a hunt. It was a lesson. Mikhail's breath fogged fast beside me. If it keeps coming, wait, I said. My voice surprised me. Calm, low. The smaller creature took another step forward, then another. Each placement of its foot was deliberate, heel pressing first before weight transferred forward, testing depth, texture, resistance, learning terrain the way we teach children to cross thin ice. Halfway across the clearing, it stopped. The wind shifted and carried our scent outward. Its nostrils flared. I felt that old pull again, that sense of being singled out in a crowd, only two beings occupied. The larger one's gaze locked onto me through the glass, not blinking, not impatient. I understood then. This wasn't about territory. It was about threshold, the door. Slowly I reached for the handle. Mikhail grabbed my arm. Have you lost your mind? Probably, I answered. The metal was freezing under my palm. I turned it carefully, easing the door open just enough for cold to flood the room. Air knifed across my face, stealing breath instantly. I stepped outside alone. Behind me, I heard Mikhail curse under his breath, but he didn't follow. The snow compressed under my boots with small, brittle snaps. I stopped a few meters from the entrance, not advancing further. The smaller one tilted its head slightly. I saw it clearly now. The proportions were leaner than the elder's, fur less dense around the shoulders, the amber in its eyes brighter, almost curious. The claws flexed once at its sides, reflex, not threat. The larger one remained still. I raised my empty hands slowly, palms outward, a universal gesture, non-aggression. It felt absurd and ancient at the same time. The smaller creature's gaze dropped briefly to my scarred wrist. Recognition. A low vibration rippled outward, not from the larger one this time, from the smaller, softer, higher in tone, less resonance but unmistakably patterned. A question. I swallowed. My throat burned in the cold. You don't belong to the ice anymore, I said quietly, knowing words were meaningless, but needing to anchor myself. And neither do we. The smaller one took a single step closer. The distance between us shrank to less than 20 meters, close enough that I could see subtle muscle contractions beneath fur, close enough that I could see intelligence calculating variables, distance to door, response time, terrain obstacles. Behind it, the larger one shifted weight slightly, not forward, not back, monitoring. The younger creature lowered to 4 limbs briefly, then rose again, practicing fluidity, demonstrating control. It wanted to show it could move between forms seamlessly. I felt an unsettling parallel forming in my mind. We had once transitioned too, nomadic to settled, prey to apex. We adapted to climates, reshaped ecosystems. What if they had once competed with us for that dominance? What if ice had not erased them, but postponed the contest? The younger one stopped advancing. It extended one forelimb slightly forward, claws retracting halfway. The gesture wasn't strike-ready. It was exploratory. An echo. The ridge. The moment before it grabbed my wrist. My pulse quickened involuntarily. The scar throbbed again, phantom pain radiating up my arm. The larger one's low resonance rolled faintly from the tree line, measured, restrained. Instruction. The younger creature froze instantly at the sound. So that was the boundary. It could approach. It could assess. But not yet engage. This wasn't recklessness. It was curriculum. I took one slow step backward toward the station door. The younger one's eyes tracked the motion. No aggression, just analysis. When my heel touched the threshold, the larger one finally moved. One step forward out of the shadow, enough to make its presence undeniable. A reminder. This exchange was permitted, not equal. Permitted. The younger creature lowered to 4 limbs, and without breaking eye contact, retreated step by measured step back toward the tree line. No rush, no panic. When it reached the elder's side, it paused and glanced upward briefly, as if awaiting evaluation. The larger one gave a deeper vibration, longer this time. Approval. They turned together and slipped into the forest. The clearing was empty again. I stood there long after they vanished, lungs burning from cold I barely felt anymore. Behind me, the station door creaked open further, and Mikhail stepped out cautiously. "You're alive," he said, disbelief heavy in his voice. "For now," I replied. He stared at the forest edge. What did it want? I didn't answer immediately, because the realization was settling with a weight I couldn't deflect. It wanted to see if we would strike first, if we were predictable, if we were driven by fear more than calculation. And we had hesitated. We had shown restraint. That was data. We went back inside, sealing the door, reinforcing locks that suddenly felt symbolic rather than protective. The lab monitor still glowed with genetic sequences, those impossible braided markers intertwining human and something older. A lineage paused in ice, now mobile, now teaching. Mikhail sank into a chair, hands covering his face. "This is escalation," he muttered. "Yes," I said quietly, but not in the way he meant. This wasn't escalation toward violence. It was escalation toward coexistence, or conflict at a scale we weren't prepared for. The vibration didn't return that night. That absence unsettled me more than the sound ever had, because silence means planning. Near dawn, as weak light began to bleed into the horizon, I checked the exterior cameras. They hadn't approached the building again. Instead, new tracks circled wider around the perimeter, expanding radius, mapping range. The younger one's stride length had increased. Its bipedal impressions were steadier now, progress measurable within days. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion finally pressing against my skull. This was no longer about a single preserved anomaly. It was about adaptation accelerating under observation. We had become part of its environment, a variable to incorporate, a force to test. And beneath the ridge, the ground continued to sag by millimeters. I checked the seismic sensor readings one more time before sunrise. There it was again, that faint, rhythmic tremor, slower than before, but stronger. Not directly under the original sag now, shifted, closer to the riverbank, closer to migratory paths. I closed my eyes. The larger one was teaching, the younger one was learning, and something else, something still entombed, was moving. The tremor near the riverbank didn't stop. It deepened over the next 48 hours, subtle but measurable, a slow percussion beneath layers of ancient soil. I stopped pretending it was shifting ice. The seismic readings formed a pattern too regular, too intentional. Mikhail watched the monitors in exhausted silence, while outside the forest maintained its careful distance. The larger and smaller shapes no longer approached the station directly. They widened their perimeter, expanding circles in the snow like surveyors marking future foundations. The younger one's stride grew longer, more confident, bipedal stretches extending dozens of meters before dropping seamlessly to 4. Each day it tested new variables: fence lines, empty sheds, the edges of livestock enclosures without breaching them. It wasn't feeding recklessly, it was studying reactions. We began hearing reports from villages along the Lena. Doors found scratched but not broken, livestock uninjured but agitated, sightings dismissed as hysteria. I recognized the curriculum: proximity without violence, pressure without attack, teaching humans to normalize their presence. And beneath the ridge, something heavier shifted closer to release. I returned there alone before dawn on the 3rd day, unable to endure waiting. The sag had widened into a shallow depression. Steam rose faintly despite the cold. I felt the vibration through my knees as I crouched, stronger now, faster. The larger one stepped into view behind me without sound. I didn't turn immediately. I knew it was there by the way the tremor synchronized with its low resonance. Not random, not independent, coordinated. The ground split with a sharp crack that echoed down the frozen slope. Ice sheared inward. A dark mass pressed upward from below, fur matted with meltwater, shoulders broader than the first. The head emerged slowly, amber eyes already open, already aware. Not confused, not feral, oriented. It inhaled deeply, scenting air it hadn't breathed in millennia. The larger one did not assist physically. It stood sentinel, vibrating low and steady, as if guiding the ascent. The emerging creature hauled itself free with deliberate power, ice sloughing from its spine. 3 now stood on the ridge. The younger one appeared moments later at the tree line, watching. No frenzy, no chaos. This was choreography. I understood then that dormancy had not erased hierarchy. It had preserved it. The one rising from the ice was older, denser, carrying scars beneath fur that spoke of eras before ours. Its gaze found me last, held, not hostile, evaluative. I felt small in a way I never had before, not prey but precedent. We were not discovering them, we were being reintroduced. I did not run, I did not speak. The older creature released a resonance deeper than the others, a vibration that rolled through bone and soil alike. The ground seemed to answer. In the distance along the ridge, subtle fractures spidered across snowfields where permafrost thinned. Not one chamber, many. The implication struck with sickening clarity. Climate was not their ally by accident, it was their clock. They had endured in stasis, while our species multiplied, industrialized, warmed the planet. And now the thaw was unlocking a lineage engineered for endurance, intelligence braided with ours at some prehistoric divergence we never documented. The older one stepped forward, towering even over the first. It lowered its head slightly, studying my scarred wrist. Recognition passed through all 3 like a current. The younger one shifted weight eagerly, but did not advance without signal. The older released a short pulse of sound, and the younger stilled instantly. Discipline layered through generations. I realized with cold precision that they were not preparing to slaughter villages. They were assessing coexistence parameters, testing human thresholds before committing to expansion. If we attacked blindly, we would confirm hostility and accelerate conflict. If we ignored them, they would continue mapping until advantage favored them fully. I stood between 2 evolutionary trajectories converging again after Ice Age separation. The older creature's eyes held no hatred, only inevitability. It turned first, descending the ridge toward the riverbank, where migratory routes braided through open terrain. The larger followed, then the younger, glancing back once with something disturbingly close to curiosity rather than threat. I was left on fractured ground, listening as distant cracks echoed like muffled drums across the thawing expanse. Back at the station, I made the decision that will define the rest of my life. I encrypted the genetic data and transmitted it to no authority. Instead, I sent a heavily redacted ecological anomaly report, suggesting immediate restriction of industrial activity along key thaw corridors. No monsters, no dogmen, just unstable ground and unknown megafauna risk. It was the only language institutions would heed without mobilizing eradication teams. Mikhail wanted evacuation. I refused. Someone needed to witness without escalating. Over the next weeks, sightings increased, but fatalities did not. Livestock disappeared selectively. Predation patterns avoided dense human zones. The three shapes were seen at distances, upright silhouettes on ridgelines at dusk, then gone. And beneath other stretches of permafrost, seismic murmurs multiplied. Not explosive awakenings, gradual ones. A network stirring, rather than a single outbreak. I understood then why I had been spared. Not mercy, not accident, utility. I was proof that humans could encounter them and choose restraint. A data point in their assessment of us. If I broke that pattern, if I advocated annihilation, the next interactions would not be measured. They would be decisive. Now, months later, I feel the planet itself shifting under the weight of thaw. News cycles speak of infrastructure collapse, methane release, climate tipping points. They do not speak of amber eyes watching from tree lines, of young figures practicing upright strides in widening arcs. But I know. The ice was never just preservation. It was incubation. And the thaw is not random disaster. It is revelation. We believed ourselves the final architects of this world, apex without rival. But something endured in patience beneath our certainty. Something that learned while frozen. Something that wakes without rage, only calculation. The older one's gaze on that ridge was not a promise of immediate war. It was an acknowledgement of shared inheritance. We survived by adapting faster than anything else. Now adaptation has competition again. I still smell wet iron sometimes when the wind shifts. I still wake with the sensation of ancient fingers closing around my bones. But I no longer mistake it for nightmare. It is memory and warning intertwined. The permafrost is opening across continents. Chambers we never mapped are thinning. If more rise, they will not rush cities blindly. They will observe, integrate, expand where resistance is weakest. And if conflict comes, it will not begin with claws in the night. It will begin with a choice, ours, to respond with fear or with strategy. I stand at the edge of that decision every day. Because I was there when the first eyes opened in ice, and I laughed instead of listening. I won't make that mistake again. The ground is thawing, they are waking, and this time we are not alone at the top of the food chain. Spring never truly arrives in Yakutsk. It seeps in like an infection. Snow collapses into gray slush. The river groans beneath thinning ice. The air loses its knife edge and becomes heavy, wet, almost intimate. That was when the tremors multiplied. Not violent ruptures, subtle pulses scattered along satellite readings like distant heartbeats sinking across a buried network. I stopped sleeping properly. Every vibration felt personal now. Every data spike carried implication. Reports from outlying settlements shifted in tone, not panic. Adjustment. Livestock losses stabilized rather than spiked. Nighttime silhouettes were described with less hysteria and more resignation. Large upright animal near tree line. Tracks switching patterns. No aggression. The absence of chaos was the most terrifying detail. Predators announced themselves through imbalance. These were integrating without destabilizing, expanding territory in widening, calculated arcs that avoided military installations, avoided dense population clusters, avoided patterns that would trigger immediate extermination campaigns. Intelligence layered over instinct, strategy over hunger. I returned to the ridge repeatedly, charting collapse points. 3 additional depressions had begun to sag, not as advanced as the first 2, but unmistakable. The older one no longer appeared openly. The larger and younger did, occasionally, distant on ridgelines at dusk. The younger now moved upright, more often than not, gait smooth, efficient. I watched it pause once near a herd and deliberately redirect its path away from open confrontation, teaching restraint, or perhaps being taught it still. One evening, as fog from the river rolled low and thick, I felt the resonance before I heard it. A deep, synchronized vibration that seemed to travel through my rib cage rather than my ears. I turned toward the forest edge. They were there, 3 silhouettes at first, then a 4th shape emerging behind them, broader than the younger, narrower than the elder. Newly risen. Its fur still clung in damp clumps, movements slightly stiff but purposeful. My throat tightened. The thaw was accelerating. They arranged themselves not in a hunting formation, but in a staggered line, facing the open expanse toward the river valley. A survey. The older one stood at the center, the younger slightly forward, as if being positioned to see further. The new emergence held back, adjusting balance. I realized I was witnessing orientation. The world had changed while they slept. Rivers shifted, forest density altered, human structures multiplied. They were absorbing it in silence. The older one's head turned slowly toward me across the distance. Even through fog, I felt the weight of its recognition. This was no longer introduction. It was acknowledgement of persistence. We had both survived the ages in different ways. Now our territories overlapped again. I took a step forward without fully understanding why. The mud sucked lightly at my boots, where snow had receded. My scar burned faintly, phantom echo of first contact. The younger one mirrored my step with one of its own, not closing distance aggressively, matching movement. A negotiation of space measured in meters. The new emergence shifted uneasily, releasing a shorter, rougher vibration. Inexperience. The older answered with a steadier tone that smoothed the tension instantly. Hierarchy maintained. No chaos. I felt something settle into grim acceptance. They were not a plague. They were a population. Slow growing but deliberate. Climate models projected continued thaw for decades. If even a fraction of buried chambers held viable bodies, their numbers would rise gradually, not explosively. Enough to establish range before global systems reacted. And if we responded with firepower, the first casualties would likely be human. Rangers, soldiers, civilians caught in miscalculation. Because these beings did not rush into gunfire. They studied weaknesses first. I lowered my gaze briefly, a gesture I didn't consciously choose. Not submission. Recognition of equal presence. When I looked up again, the younger one was closer by several steps, upright and steady, amber eyes clear in the fading light. No snarl, no bared teeth, only appraisal. It extended one forelimb slightly outward, claws relaxed, echoing that first exploratory gesture months ago. My breath caught. The older's resonance hummed low behind it, neither prohibiting nor urging. Allowing. I did not reach out this time. I simply held my ground. The younger lowered its arm slowly and shifted its stance, as if concluding an internal calculation. Then it turned its head toward the valley where distant lights from a settlement flickered faintly through mist. That glance carried more weight than any display of aggression could have. They were aware of our density, our infrastructure, our patterns of movement. The older released one final, deep vibration that rolled outward across water and mud. Not a threat, a marker. The four shapes pivoted in unison and began moving along the ridge parallel to the river, not toward the village, but tracing its perimeter from distance, establishing corridor. The fog swallowed them gradually until only the tremor beneath my feet lingered. I stood alone again with the damp wind pressing cold against my face. This was no longer about a hidden horror waiting to ambush humanity. It was about two intelligent lineages sharing warming ground, neither fully controlled. They would not announce themselves dramatically. They would spread quietly along thaw lines, adapting to our presence while testing limits. And if we panicked, if we attacked prematurely, the delicate pattern of measured coexistence would fracture into something far worse. I returned to the station and began compiling a new report, not to expose them, not to mythologize, but to shift policy subtly toward restricted development in key thaw corridors. Ecological hazard, structural instability, anything but the truth. Because the truth would ignite fear faster than ice melts. That night, seismic monitors lit with additional faint pulses farther north. Not synchronized yet, but trending. The network was widening. I leaned back in the dim lab, listening to the hum of equipment and the distant groan of river ice surrendering to spring. I no longer felt like the sole witness. I felt like a bridge, fragile, temporary, between species reacquainting themselves after an absence measured in epochs. The memory of amber eyes in permafrost no longer carried only dread. It carried inevitability. We are not being hunted, not yet. We are being evaluated. And somewhere beyond the fog, along ridges where thaw exposes forgotten chambers, more eyes may already be opening, not in rage, not in confusion, but in patient calculation. The world is warming, the ice is thinning, and something that once lost its place at the top of the food chain is rising carefully, deliberately, to see whether that place is still vacant. The world is warming faster than our models predicted. Permafrost collapses are logged as infrastructure hazards, methane events, economic threats. That's the language we use when we don't want to admit something older is pushing upward through the cracks. I still monitor the seismic feeds at night. I still track the subtle pulses that don't match tectonic behavior. They're spreading north and east in slow, deliberate constellations. Not random, never random. I used to believe I opened a door. Now I understand the door was already unlocked. We just accelerated the thaw. I think about that laugh on the ridge more than I think about the blood. That brittle, dismissive sound. The moment I chose explanation over instinct, science over warning. It wasn't ignorance, it was arrogance. I saw amber eyes open in ice and decided they were only reflecting light. They were measuring it, measuring me. The scar on my wrist aches when the temperature drops. 5 crescent reminders that contact was deliberate, not chaotic. It could have killed me. It didn't. That restraint wasn't mercy. It was evaluation. A variable introduced into an ancient equation. Are we predictable? Are we violent? Are we capable of restraint? So far, we have hesitated, and they are watching what hesitation means. Villages report silhouettes at distance. Upright figures on ridgelines at dusk. Livestock taken selectively, never wastefully. No massacres, no displays. Just incremental expansion along thaw corridors where the ground softens first. The younger ones move with growing confidence. The older ones keep distance. The network beneath the ice continues to murmur. Dormancy was not extinction. It was patience. Sometimes, when the wind comes off the river just right, I hear that low vibration again, not loud enough for others to notice. It settles into my chest the way it did the first time. Not a roar, not a threat, a signal. We are not alone at the top of the hierarchy anymore. And the terrifying part is this: they are not rushing to take it back. They are studying us the way we once studied wolves, mapping our movements, testing our boundaries, waiting to see if coexistence is efficient, or if correction is necessary. The ice is thinning across continents. Chambers we never catalogued are destabilizing. Somewhere beneath collapsing ridges and sagging tundra, more amber eyes may already be opening. Not confused, not enraged, but oriented, braced, ready to ascend. I was there when the first one rose. I felt ancient fingers close around my bones. I heard breath that had not touched open air in thousands of years. And I laughed. I won't laugh again, because this isn't a monster story. It's a reintroduction. The permafrost kept its secret long enough for us to forget we once shared this planet with something that could stand upright, think strategically, and endure longer than empires. Now the thaw is undoing that forgetfulness. The ground is softening. The tremors are spreading. The silhouettes are multiplying at the edges of light. And somewhere beyond the tree line, something patient is deciding whether we deserve the position we've claimed, or whether it's time to compete for it again.